Okay, I think, well, it's 5 o'clock. Program items have been starting more or less on time. Somebody comes in, they can, like, ask me to recap what I'm about to say, which is going to be very brief. I'm going to do, like, a brief intro. So, welcome to the Xen BoF. I'm Ian Jackson. I'm one of the Xen committers upstream. I'm also one of the co-maintainers now of Xen in Debian. I was the only maintainer for a bit. So, where are we? During the Buster cycle, I redid the packaging of the package, and it is now basically based on DH and more or less comprehensible. Partially as a result of that, I think, I now have a co-maintainer, which is good. More help is definitely wanted. You don't need a particularly high level of skill. There are those of us who have a lot of experience available, but we're kind of lacking sometimes effort. So, yes, on to current status. So, status in Buster. Buster, we've not updated anything between Buster and what's currently in SID. Buster has Xen 4.11, which is pretty reasonable. We kind of missed the boat with 4.12, but the freeze timing wasn't, the Xen release timing and the Debian freeze timing wasn't propitious for getting 4.12 into Buster. And we probably won't try to do an update, a stable update for that, because the Xen major version updates are quite disruptive. Testing and Buster are up to date with security advisories, I think. I've double checked. So that is all relatively good. The situation with Stretch is less good. Stretch has 4.8, and I know a lot of people are still using Stretch. Xen users tend to be quite conservative. There are a number of outstanding security bugs with 4.8, which I have been too busy conferencing to fix. That's basically a question of updating to the Xen 4.8 stable branch upstream, which I hope to do fairly soon. If somebody else wants to kind of do that and test the package, that would be great. Older than Stretch, I can't really speak to. There is some 4.4 thing in Jesse. I hope nobody's running that. Please don't be running that. Because it's really out of support upstream and not very good. So upstream, we have spent an enormous amount of our effort over the past couple of years on speculative execution stuff. Particularly core hypervisor developers have been really very busy. Many things that we wanted to do upstream we have not really managed to do because dealing with mostly Intel CPU problems has been a big problem, and Spectre and speculative execution vulnerabilities continue to be a problem, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. This is going to keep going on. We may find that the degree to which it's sucking out effort shrinks somewhat. So, well, this is supposed to be a BoF. You don't look very chirpy, but I wanted you to tell me kind of, I don't know. So that's where we are. I was basically going to package 4.12. I think Hans will probably get around to that at some point maybe, or I will do it. And then we'll have 4.12 or maybe even a 4.13 pre-release in Bullseye. I think we're probably going to keep Bullseye a bit closer to upstream's latest release rather than doing like one big chunky update near the end of the Debian release cycle, hopefully. We've switched the Git packaging to Git debris-based format. This is a very new tool, but Hans seems to like it, which is good. this allows us to maintain what is currently our 50 patch stack with a relative amount of ease. We are, of course, hoping to shrink that. Some of that stuff is going upstream. I've spoken to, through my links with the upstream community, I've spoken to people who've been maintaining Xen packages in other distros, and they're actually quite interested in our multi-version support thing, where you can co-install the tools for multiple versions and have smooth reboots, which is not current. Debian are currently the only people who do that. So maybe we can get some of that file rearrangement upstream. So tell me what your opinions are. Do you have questions, pain points?
Just get you, Fred.
Perhaps rather general, or two questions. One rather general. What do you expect is going to happen or change in general? And a bit more specific. Is there anything changing regarding, or any changes upcoming regarding the device model and the virtualization method this direction?
Right. Okay. That's actually an interesting. That's a good question. So, let me take the first question first, because there's a kind of community angle to that, right? So, one of the things that's happening, and that's quite exciting in the Xen community right now, is we're getting a lot of interest from ARM people, including some ARM embedded people. We're getting a lot more ARM effort. They're taking an interest in things in general, so I'm looking forward to that. As I say, our Intel effort is a bit swamped with speculative execution stuff. We have been working on new execution modes, some of which have some better properties. So we've already... So Xen traditionally on x86, on ARM things are a bit different, but on x86 we've traditionally had PV, which involves kernel patches so that all the page tables manipulation has to be redirected via Xen. And you modify the guest operating system quite substantially, at least in the page handling and interrupt dispatch and stuff like that. That's been very well supported by Linux as a guest for a long time, and it's the way that you would typically run your DOM0, your host domain. And we have HVM, which is full PC virtualization, and that has been done with, essentially we reuse the PC emulation stuff in QMU and sort of use QMU as an emulator for MMIO and IO requests, and the actual execution still happens on the CPU in a virtualized CPU mode. Now, there are some difficulties with the PV model. The Linux people don't like the effect it has on their page table code. I can see their point. Personally, I don't think PV is going away anytime soon, because it's a way that you can run Xen. You can run Xen in PV mode on many full-on cloud instances, and run your own little hypervisor there underneath or on top of whatever the cloud provides, which can be really quite convenient, and a lot of people like to do that. Performance is not always brilliant, but that can be quite useful. But we have been working on a new mode called PVH, and all these acronyms are a bit confusing. I don't think PVH really stands for anything. What it involves is using the memory management virtualization features of the CPU, but not, and the other virtualization features of modern CPUs, but not running a complete PC emulation. So that still needs some support from the guest operating system, because particularly during boot, it doesn't have, it doesn't have a traditional x86 keyboard controller, it doesn't have a VGA card, all these other kind of things that it would have been expecting aren't there. That part is actually quite close to being fixed by UEFI. One of my colleagues has managed to boot an unmodified UEFI guest under Xen PVH with UEFI firmware, because all the drivers then are in the UEFI image in the firmware, which we supply, and that knows how to drive the paravirtualized, the Xen-specific interfaces. So PVH avoids some of those kind of annoyances. It also has, for many situations, better performance. I won't go into too many details, but in PV, particularly 64-bit Xen PV, system calls are very expensive because they have to cross many CPU modes backwards and forwards. And in PVH, that's no longer the case. PVH overall seems to have a nicer architecture, but it does depend on those CPU virtualization extensions, which typical cloud instances don't provide you with, and I think there may still be some CPUs being manufactured without. We do think it's probably a large part of the future, though, and we are at some point probably going to change the default guest type from PV to PVH. And you probably won't notice very much difference, but the code paths underneath and the architecture are quite different. So from a config file point of view, everything's very simple. You just change the guest type, but underneath, things are quite different. So PVH gets rid of the QMU device model. It gets rid of the PC emulator. But if you do need that PC emulator, if you want to run an unmodified guest, that expects a PC. There are rumors that you might be able to boot Windows under PVH UEFI, but I think that's still mostly rumors. Some people think it will be possible, but for many unmodified operating systems, particularly older ones, you'll still be using HVM, and then you need the device model emulator. So QMU provides all this emulator on an emulated IDE controller, and an emulated keyboard controller, an emulated video card, an emulated network card, and that stuff has a huge attack surface. And historically, it's been a big source of bugs. The QMU project are quite limited in their security support scope. I think most users are within upstream QMU security support scope, that is also an issue. So we think that ideally you shouldn't have to trust that QMU doesn't have bugs in its device emulation. And for a long time we've supported a thing called stub device models upstream, where you compile QMU in a strange way, and it runs in its own domain. Now that involved a fork of QMU, which was made, I think, over a decade ago, and has last seen an update about 5 years ago, and has had tiny bug fixes ever since. That thing is not in Debian, because do we want... I don't think the Debian FTP masters and the Debian project as a whole would be really happy with the idea of trying to get some 5-year-old QMU fork that with pieces of rotting zombie flesh falling off it and trying to get that through new. That doesn't really seem attractive. So for a long time upstream, we've been trying to retire that, but it's our main solution for this, for people who have a high security, want a good security profile. So we have kind of two branches to fixing that. One of those is we've been doing quite a lot of work on using kernel features in DOM0 to restrict the privilege of the device model. So QMU, now this is not yet the default configuration, and the security support is not completely perfect in the sense that we don't guarantee that the extra security benefits are there, although you won't be any worse off. If you enable the QMU restrict, or as it's called, QMU deprivilege mode, QMU will run as a normal user, and it won't be able to make general hypercalls. And so that is a feature that is in Xen 4.12, which is not yet. It's not in Buster, and it's not yet in Bullseye. But when we package 4.12, it will be there, and you'll be able to say dm restrict equals 1, and then if you are within the footprint of the stuff that works, there are some things that don't work. The most notable one of those is CD-ROM insert doesn't work, because when you try to insert the CD-ROM, QMU tries to open the file with the CD-ROM image, and, well, we've stopped it from opening arbitrary files as root, so it can't. We're working on, there's a design for a fix for that. We've got a huge, in fact, I gave a talk about QMU deprivileging at the Xen Summit. And there's a huge table of kind of the ways in which we have restricted QMU, the things that still need to be nailed down, and the things that don't work quite right yet, and the things that still aren't properly tested.
Is there this outline of the talk or the content available?
The talk, yes, the talk is completely online. Probably the best thing to do is for me to, like, I'll send the URL to the DebConf discuss list after the BoF, unless you really want to look at it now. Otherwise, I think I have it somewhere in my laptop, but I'll find it for you. So the other approach that we think is viable now is to run QMU, a fairly stock QMU, in a kind of custom Linux domain. So you have a Linux kernel and an init remfs and a copy of QMU and whatever QMU needs to run. And because it runs as its own Xen domain, it doesn't have privilege over the whole system. And that deals with the security problem in a different way. It's probably better from a security point of view, but from a deployment point of view, it's more complicated because you have this other domain going on. It's somewhat less scalable. If you are trying to run hundreds of domains, maybe even thousands of domains on a single host, then that would double the number of domains if they were all HVM domains with this subdomain thing going on. But for really high security applications, it's a good idea. We know of at least 2 Xen downstreams that are taking this approach. One of them is Cubes, and the other one is OpenXT. You've probably heard of Cubes. OpenXT are a multi-level secure Xen system for running essentially on your laptop. It was originally done by Citrix and then became an open source project. We don't have the code for that upstream. There are some... It's a bit complicated because it's difficult to see how upstream, do we really want to get into the business of like becoming a Linux distro? Because effectively this little thing with QMU in it is a Linux distro. We think we've settled on the idea that we will allow, we upstream will expect Xen downstreams to do that part, but we will provide the necessary plumbing and the tooling to make the command line options for QMU right and all that kind of thing. I'm cautiously optimistic. Whether that will make it into Xen 4.13 is that I don't think we'll have that complete in Xen 4.13. It might very well be deployable in Bullseye. Debian release cycles being quite what they are. I think we could possibly expect that in Bullseye. The difficulty of producing that init ramfs image, we already have tooling in Debian for doing that. Init ramfs tools can probably do much of that if we feed it a different pile of config. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Yes, very helpful.
Sorry, that was maybe a bit of a longer answer than you were.
Perfect. I'm very happy.
Is everybody happy? What is there not to like? Right? There must be something wrong. Nothing. You're all... But there's... we've got a small sample here, but... is anybody watching IRC? Maybe... Just check. It's possible that we've got no. Okay, well, if you don't have any, I mean, I don't have any more prepared material, so.
We can end. It's fine.
Last call for questions, comments. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.